Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to be looking at making perceptive and sophisticated inferences. Now that is AO1 in both literature and language for AQA, and actually it's one of the really important skills. It is a basic skill that we need to be able to tackle all of these questions, but actually it's something that can really differentiate, I think, between the top bands and not gaining the top bands. In the top bands in both literature and language, students are able to make really perceptive comments. They're able to be sophisticated and they're able to, you've probably heard teachers say this before, read between the lines. Well, what that actually means is that to a degree you're a bit like a detective. So you're going around the text and surveying it and looking for information. But I also like to think about it in terms of an iceberg. Often in a text, there is something that we can see, but this is really only part of the picture, and below the surface there is a lot more going on. And when you're interpreting these texts, it's up to you to find those deeper meanings, those things that are under the surface that aren't that obvious for us to see, that the writer has intended us to understand. Okay, so the first thing that we need to think about is, what is an inference? So essentially, an inference is your ability to interpret what you've read, what you've seen. So if we have a look at this picture, for example, there are different levels to this. There are things that we know, things that we can see in this picture. There are things that we can deduce from it, and there are things that actually we only can infer. And inference, therefore, is slightly open to interpretation. So, for example, we know that there are three people in this picture. There is a house that's on its side, and there is water across the ground. We can deduce that there's been some form of accident, perhaps by looking at the weather. Perhaps we can deduce that there's been some sort of storm. But our inferences are open to interpretation. So we don't know what's going on in this picture. It could be that there's been a really high tide and a storm that has flooded the streets and the houses, gone into the water. It could be that they're experiencing a hurricane. It could be a tsunami. These people could be escaping from danger. They could be going to rescue somebody. We can probably infer by the fact that the men either side, the fact that they're holding on to each other so tightly and they're crouching, means that there is a strong wind. But all of these are open to interpretation. So there are two different levels, therefore, when we look closely at a text. There is the explicit or the obvious meanings, and there is the implicit or the hidden. And if we think back to our iceberg, the top of the iceberg is the explicit or the obvious meaning that we can see, and the implicit is hidden below the surfaces. So when we look at a text, we need to look closely at it. We need to think about what certain words and phrases mean. So before we even get to what they could suggest, we need to think about what they mean. Then we need to read between the lines. Okay, that's why we need to look underneath the surface. What might it suggest that isn't really obvious? And remember that you could infer something different to another student. So when we say that everything's open to interpretation, we're not lying, because inferences are open to interpretation, but of course there is probably only one actual factual meaning or obvious meaning to a text, and then there's alternative interpretations of the implicit meanings. So if we look again at this picture, we can talk about what we can see in it. That's what's explicit and obvious, and we can think about what we can infer from it. That is our inferences. What is implicit, what is hidden. So our inference is what we can infer, what is below the surface. All sorts of different texts are good for analysing inferences, or for thinking about different inferences, and the writers of different texts will be trying to get across a certain interpretation to the reader intentionally. I know that sometimes you say to me, well, maybe the curtains are just blue because they were just blue. I understand, however, a writer will have put a lot of thought into the words and phrases that they're using. And one thing you can do when you look at a text, whether it's non-fiction or fiction, is take out a lot of the descriptive words, a lot of the adjectives or adverbs. Think to yourself, what do these words suggest? What can you deduce from them? And then to get those higher bands, what else? So if we isolate some of the words from this text, which is about shark attack, We've got words to describe the shark, such as monster, huge, colossal, giant, and immense. All of those words mean big, okay? We know that the meaning is that the shark is big. What it suggests is that it's really big because it's emphasizing it. But actually, if we look a little bit deeper, why use the word monster? Why use the word huge? Why use the word giant? So huge and immense are really exaggerating how big it is, as is colossal, but they all have slightly different meanings as well. So a monster is something that is inhuman. We know it's not human, it's a shark, but it's something almost supernatural. The same with a giant. A giant is something you might see in a fairy tale that may not be real. So it's almost mythologically huge, okay, which is slightly different than just saying it's really big. So those students who want to get into the top bands, you really need to be thinking a bit more deeply. And actually, half the work with inference comes through thinking. Okay, you're just thinking a little bit more deeply, and then writing up your responses. But it does also come with practice. So I want to show you this in action. So here is a little bit of an extract from Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. There was Mandalay, our Mandalay, secretive and silent as it had always been, the grey stones shining in the moonlight of my dream, the mullioned windows reflecting the green lawns and the terrace. Time could not wreck the perfect symmetry of those walls, nor the site itself a jewel in the hollow of a hand. So in this description, the writer or the narrator has gone to Mandalay, which is now completely dilapidated and run down, and is talking about what it used to be like in their memory. So time could not wreck that memory, the perfect symmetry of those walls, nor the site itself, a jewel in the hollow of a hand. Okay, so one interpretation of this and a student response could be the writer describes the house as being a jewel in the hollow of a hand. This makes the house seem pretty and precious. It emphasizes its beauty. Okay, now this is a good solid inference. It's slightly thoughtful because the fact that it is a jewel does make it seem precious beyond it just being expensive. So it's starting to go a little bit more deeply. And yet it probably means that it's attractive because a jewel's attractive, and it probably is emphasizing its beauty. Okay, so that's a good solid inference. But there are other things that we need to do to be more sophisticated and perceptive and to get those top bands, okay, to get those top marks. So we need to explain the connotations or the impressions of the descriptions, and that's happened to a degree in that last example. Probably a good thing to do is use more than one adjective when detailing your inferences. So the student has done this here, makes it seem pretty and precious. So that's pretty good. Although we could look at using more sophisticated vocabulary, and that will also really help you get those top marks. So develop your inferences by adding layers or alternative interpretations. So there is, to a degree, a layer. It emphasizes its beauty. And that's probably to do with the purpose as well, the writer's purpose, which is the purple one here. Think about the writer's purpose or the overall atmosphere created. Why has the writer deliberately created these inferences? Because the writer does have an intended effect. We also need to use discourse markers to signpost our developed or alternative interpretations to the reader, to the examiner. And we also need to reinforce our inferences with evidence from either later or earlier in the text. So here is an example of an improved response with that success criteria. The writer emphasizes the hidden beauty of the house through the simile, like a jewel in the hollow of a hand. This has connotation, so I'm signposting to the examiner here that I'm using my inferences, of a rare and precious gem. So rather than pretty, I've gone for rare and precious, which are probably a bit more specific in terms of vocabulary, hidden to a casual observer. Now, alternatively, however, so I'm signposting to the examiner now that I'm looking for an alternative interpretation. A reader may also interpret this as an aspect of constraint, like the house is being controlled or under threat somehow. That's because it's right in the middle of the hollow of a hand, there's a hand around it. So there's a sense of danger there, that it could be hidden, but it could be held together. Okay, so why use the description of a hand? There's a reason for that. So this idea of the house being hidden or precious is reinforced through the sibilant phrase secret and silent. So this is now I'm developing by using a quote from somewhere else in the text to reinforce my inferences. again hinting at a more sinister and secretive atmosphere. Perhaps the writer. Okay, so we can see there how it's developed and detailed. And of course, understanding what the writer is trying to do is dependent on an understanding of the writer's purpose. Now, this is much easier in literature than it is in language. So although we are going to be tentative anyway and say perhaps or maybe, sometimes it is easier just to talk about the overall atmosphere or mood which is created within the piece. So also remember that we need to use sophisticated academic vocabulary, so there are lots of synonyms for show or alternative words. So show, imply, demonstrate, indicate, suggest, creates a notion that, has connotations of, highlights, illustrates. The list is to a degree endless, but these are some of the ones that are my favourites. You don't have to use a different one each time, and actually you'll get more marks for using the word show and saying something sophisticated about it than you would be for using the word highlights or illustrates or promulgates the notion that, if we want to get really fancy, and saying something that's actually not very deep. Okay, so another thing that you can do if you're finding it difficult is think about visualizing an inference map. So choosing one quote, and you can do this in practice as well. So you can write a quote down and then try and map it out. It suggests this, it could also suggest this, however, it could suggest this furthermore. So thinking about similar interpretations where you're going deep through layers, and then thinking of alternatives. So levels, deep, and alternative meanings. Okay, and any other evidence that you have to support that. It is possible to get full marks in a response by only exploring one or two quotes if you go into huge amounts of detail about it and the writer's purpose. That's a hard skill, but something that is possible. Okay, so hopefully that has been useful for you. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions.